Okay, we're about to get started with our lunch session. I hope that everyone has had an enjoyable first half of the day, and we look forward to the rest of our time together today. So if you have not, lunch is over to my right. Please make sure that you partake as we begin to move into this particular session. So I have the exciting honor to present our moderator for this particular session. Our moderator for Towards Equity and Justice, Exploring the Imperative of Reparations. It's being moderated by Ms. Renee Hatcher. She is a human rights and community development lawyer. She is an associate professor of law and the director of the Community Enterprise and Solidarity Economy Clinic at the University of Illinois, Chicago, a pro bono legal clinic that provides pre-legal support to community-based businesses, nonprofits, cooperatives, and other solidarity economy enterprises. Since March of 2023, Ms. Hatcher also serves as the co-director of Solidarity Economy Research, Policy, and Law Project. Renee has a significant amount of experience organizing and providing legal support to worker centers, worker cooperatives, and community-based initiatives to empower workers and community residents. So without further ado, I introduce to you and present to others our moderator for our lunch panel, Ms. Renee Hatcher.
Thank you so much. Can you all hear me? We've been having some mic issues. I'll switch mics if you can't hear me.
Oh, yeah.
I need to talk louder? Okay. Okay, I will project. Good afternoon. It's so good to be back at this conference with everyone, to be in the room with everyone, to try to move collectively forward towards a Black cooperative agenda. So I have the distinct pleasure of moderating our lunch panel, in which we're really going to focus on the way in which reparations is an important part and site of struggle, and also the need to think about collective ownership, cooperative development, and building collectively stewarded institutions, right, to address specific harms that have happened to the Black community. And so if I could just maybe frame us just for a second, you know, in a moment in which states and different locales are actually banning the teaching of Black history and specific texts on the transatlantic slave trade, in understanding and keeping folks from the reality of the development of capital accumulation in this country, and in also thinking about being here in St. Paul, just miles from where George Floyd was murdered just now, maybe 4 years ago, right? The conversation and organizing around reparations is as important as ever. In thinking about the continued institutions and thinking about the ongoing justice of how this country came to be. And so just to ground us a little bit, you know, I just want to say a few things, right? Reparations are a specific set of harms to a specific people with a specific set of redress. And so I think often the reparations conversations is sometimes just centered on the transatlantic slave trade and slavery in this country, but it goes far beyond that. And so I just want to make sure that we also just to note that reparations is not affirmative action, right? Reparations is not equity, diversity, and inclusion. It is a framework for justice. It is embedded in international law. It requires 5 specific elements, right? The end and guarantee of non-repetition, restitution, compensation, satisfaction, and rehabilitation. And so just in being clear in terms of what the framework looks like, you know, we have two excellent panelists who are going to talk about the local organizing work that they're doing around reparations framework, and kind of get into a conversation about why this is such an important conversation to have at the Black Cooperative Agenda Conference. So with that, I'm going to briefly introduce our two panelists. To my direct right is Davon Love. Davon is the Director of Public Policy at the Leaders for a Beautiful Struggle, or LBS, a organization, a grassroots think tank based in Baltimore that is struggling for Black liberation and Black independence. They do absolutely amazing work in Baltimore in trying to push forward both policy reforms, but also, more importantly, community-based organizing and institution building. And then to the right of Davon is Councilwoman Anika Bowie. Anika is a lifelong resident of St. Paul. She's an entrepreneur, a community organizer, creative for community change, and a policy strategist. Anika has worked on grassroots campaigns for the last 12 years and is currently a member of the St. Paul Recovery Act Commission's reparations, or Community Reparations Commission, sorry. So with that, I'm just gonna ask them to open up our conversation to talk a little bit about the respective local organizing work that they're doing around reparations, what specific harms are those that work seeks to address, and we'll jump deeper into the conversation. So I'll ask Davon to start us off. Okay, Anika, can you start us off?
Here you go. Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. I just wanted to say I appreciate everyone who's here. I haven't seen this many Black people in the Union Depot since Mayor Carter's inauguration party, since we elected our first Black mayor here in St. Paul. And it just is a very beautiful thing, not only to see, but also for us to be in this space. This is where the collaboration happens. This is where the networking happens. This is where the power happens. So like Ms. Renee has shared, I am just newly elected as a St. Paul City Council member. I am the second Black woman to serve in this position. Thank you. And also have the honor and privilege to serve along all-woman, historic women of color, majority women of color city council, so I don't do this alone. So when we talk about what reparations mean and also cooperative economics mean, it also requires collective power building. And that has always been the center of what I do in my leadership. I don't think about just one person as an individual. I don't think about one person as a leader. We have to think about how we can accomplish collective wins. So within my first term, I'm about like 6 months in, I had the honor to be able to pass a resolution to permanently restore what was Rondo Avenue back to its rightful name. Thank you. For people who do not know, Rondo was a corridor, was built by African Americans, hundreds of businesses and homes that was displaced through the construction of I-94. Rondo is a story that also Chicago, Detroit, Kansas City, New York, Black communities all across the country have experienced due to transportation policy. So when we talk about, to our sister's point, that reparations isn't just a antidote, right, solution to slavery, to transatlantic slavery. Reparations is about all type of harms that was done upon us, and transportation policy is one of those things. So with the passage of restoring Rondo Avenue, just changing the street name without addressing the economic injustices that was done, without addressing the extraction of wealth that came about, that is not enough. So last year, I do want to, because I'm all about transparency, So I was not actually the one who led the reparations commission that we have here in St. Paul. It was the council that was before me. And it was also an organizer named Charhin Cruz and a collective of community organizers who have fought for reparations on state and local levels for decades. So by the time I came into this position, I just had the honor to really vote to ensure that it was permanent. So what was supposed to be just temporary and just a study, this council voted for it to be a permanent body that's going to always live the test of time in St. Paul and address policy, short-term and long-terms, and make recommendations particularly around how the city will play a role in reparations. Another thing that was successful this year is wanting to ensure that we bring back what's called Rondo Days. Can we all say Rondo Days?
Rondo Days.
Rondo Days is a celebration that really tells the story of not only Rondo, but it's a celebration, a gathering of people. It's actually what I have found out in my lifetime, that it was one of the largest gatherings and festivals and parades in the entire Midwest, Black-led festivals. So we want to bring back Rondo Days to ensure that we have collective economics, that small businesses can be able to exchange, that small business can be able to be available, that our artists and our leaders can be able to build in their cultural arts and come together as a community, and we're really engaging and investing in our neighborhoods. So since COVID, we have not had Rondo Days since 2019. And that was something that wasn't city policy, it was truly just grassroots movement, right? So when we think about just wealth, when we think about indicators that shows resilient communities, one of those things is how is a community able to come together, put their money together, and create something as big as a festival. And one of the things that the city worked to do, that I was part of leading, is ensuring that we have a budget item that always goes to this neighborhood to be able to host their own celebration, that we should allow for Black people to create spaces for Black joy. So I'm super excited not only to be in this role. Miss Renee asked me how it's been going. I had said fun, right? And she was like, well, that's interesting, like a Black woman saying she's having fun in this political arena. But I think it's because my perspective and my optimism of how I approach this, I'm a product of the Black Power movement. I'm here to enjoy, I'm here to bring Black joy to the center of policymaking and ensuring that, thank you. Changing the narrative that yes, it has been a battle. Yes, our ancestors and we are still experiencing and combating modern day slavery, but how we show up to the table and how we show our resiliency and how we show our joy is also part of the power building movement that I'm hoping to build here.
All right, good afternoon. Can y'all hear me? Mm-hmm. All right, so as Renee mentioned, I'm Davon, Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle. What I want to do is I want to start by talking a little bit about the reparations conversation broadly, in some ways extending on some of what you mentioned, and then talk specifically about the work that we're doing in Baltimore. One of the things I think is important, particularly speaking to an audience like this, where there are lots of conversations being had about reparations and different versions of the conversation. What does it look like? How much? How do you determine who gets what? And I think it's really important when we talk about the worldview that one approaches the conversation around reparations. It is my contention that reparations emerges from a revolutionary Pan-African nationalist worldview and perspective. That perspective recognizes the centrality of the struggle for Black people to practice sovereignty and self-determination as central to the struggle for reparations. So that distinguishes the struggle for reparations from an effort to have more Black people experience the fruits of the American dream. That's a very different perspective and approach to it. And I think the conversation around reparations has been absorbed into the mainstream in a way that it reduces it to that. And so what reparations should be about, and this is part of what Renee mentioned in the introduction, that reparations is not just about repaying Black people for slavery, But the project of European domination of the world has marked the past 500 years, and it interrupted nations, right, communities that we had, right, that allowed us to be able to navigate civil society from a position of strength, dignity, and power. And so reparations has to be combined with a struggle for power, for black people to actually practice power. And you know, just to punctuate that point, the kind of dominant historiography that is made available to us as to how black people have experienced freedom or made progress to the extent that we made progress has typically been framed from the perspective of black people's ability to appeal to white folks to recognize our humanity. And we have to reject that frame, right? That I think too often we think about reparations, the conversation is how do we get white people on board? And it's important that if we're serious about actually moving policy that can produce the compensation, resources, and investments that we need a different framework that sees a theory of change that is rooted in black people's capacity to organize on our own terms to produce the political outcomes that we want. So I started with that because in Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle in Baltimore, you know, that is the perspective that we operate off of, right? And in 2022, we recognized that our legislature was going to move recreational cannabis. They were going to legalize recreational cannabis. And we saw it as an opportunity to institute a reparations policy that actually has a revenue stream attached to it. And the way that we approach it is that if we are able to deliver on reparations for the war on drugs, then that could expand to reparations beyond the war on drugs, right? And so what we were able to do is pass something called the Community Repair and Reinvestment Fund. So it's a fund that was established that 35% of the revenues from recreational cannabis goes into a fund that comes back to the communities impacted by the war on drugs. And that each jurisdiction gets a percentage of those revenues, that percentage determined by that jurisdiction's contribution to statewide cannabis possession charges over a 20-year period, ensuring that those jurisdictions hit the hardest get the largest percentage of those resources. And instead of those resources just going directly to the executive, what we wrote in the legislation was that each jurisdiction has to pass a law that determines how they spend those resources. The reason that's important because it then requires the local legislature, the local council, city or county council, and so it is the most public process that the community has the ability to pressure government to determine how they spend those resources. What we did in turn is in fulfillment of that legislative mandate for Baltimore City, we established the Baltimore Reinvestment and Reparations Commission, right? So that was something that we were able to pass through the council in August of 2023. Each council person nominating somebody to this commission, and that commission having sole authority in terms of allocating those resources. And that's important because, again, I can do more to my local council person than I can do to the executive, to the mayor or county executive. So it gave the community more ability to pressure, to put the kind of folks on this commission that'll actually deliver in terms of the community. I want to tell a quick story about how we were able to move this, because the vice chair of the finance committee in our state senate, a white man from a wealthy county in Maryland, whose vision for the redress that was implied based on moving recreational cannabis was to build essentially a nonprofit within state government to do a grant program. And one of the things that we were clear about is one of the things that happens with black folks is usually when people talk about investing in a community, it's usually in the context of human services, which isn't bad. But that's not the primary lens from which black people should be understood in terms of investment in our community, right? We need to build the kind of economic and civic infrastructure, right? So that we have the machinery to be able to properly navigate the society. And so what we were able to do was push back, and there were actually 4 out of 11 member committee, there were 4 black elected officials from majority black jurisdictions. And we sat one of them down and said, hey, it is your responsibility to make sure that this language gets in the bill that passes that establishes this fund. And so that's exactly, what those legislators did. They came together and essentially said, this bill won't move. Legalization won't happen unless this is in the bill that actually passes. And so the reason why I wanted to tell that story is because when I think about the theory of change that we use to move that, again, we weren't trying to appeal to get white people to be on board. We didn't have to. It was clear that the state wanted to legalize recreational cannabis. We understood that, we didn't want the compensation the community should get be based off of participation in the industry, right? Even if you don't want to participate in the cannabis industry, the community should get compensation for the harm that was done by the war on drugs. And so we were clear that if we get our community organized sufficiently and have the political theory of change that recognizes that we can make elected officials in positions take the posture that we need them to take, as opposed to trying to appeal to their sensibilities and get them to see it as something that they should do. From our perspective, it is a theory of change that is rooted in black political power that recognizes community control. To the extent that the community can be involved in that pressure is the extent to which we can actually be effective at actually moving policy. So that's what we've been able to do in Maryland. We're currently in the implementation phase. We're currently working with prospective commissioners to kind of set the table so that once they're appointed, they can hit the ground running, because it's going to be really important that this is successful so that the community buys in and the community can feel the impact of the resources that are going to come to the community.
And thanks so much for that. I mean, I think it's also, one, I want to highlight that Black folks have been organizing around reparations for a very long time, right? And in thinking about the seminal work of organizations like NCOBRA, and thinking about folks like Queen Mother Moore, this has been something that we've been working towards for a very long time, right? Ever since 1989, H.R. 40, which is the federal bill to just do a study about Black reparations, right, has been introduced in every single Congress till today, and yet we still have not been able to pass that, right? And so I think part of what, the work that you all are doing and in other spheres is like folks are thinking about how to use the reparations framework to do local organizing and to address, the many different harms that are at a much local level. But going back to what you said, Davon, I think the clarity around how we engage becomes so important. And I just want to kind of bring that point home in contrasting some of the case studies around reparations that have been lifted up. So one of those is Evanston.
Yes.
In Evansville, Illinois, not far from Chicago, where I'm from, right? They passed what is referred to as a reparations ordinance. And all that ordinance essentially does is give Black folks who can prove that they had a descendant who was living in Evanston for a very certain specific point of time. It gives them an opportunity to access a fund if they want to buy a house for down payment assistance, right? And it is both framed as actual reparations or redress, right? And then juxtaposing that with, I think, the clarity in which you all have been talking about engaging public policy to win a reparations for a very specific harm like the war on drugs. And even in thinking about in the state of Illinois, when we legalized cannabis, right, there was a provision that was spoke about as reparations in the sense that they created a fund, as you said, to deal with and to invest in neighborhoods that have been disproportionately impacted by the war on drugs. However, that fund has gone to human services, right? It's basically been grants to nonprofit organizations, larger nonprofit organizations. And in the way in which that funding has taken place, there's not much transparency, participation, or clear translation into how it's addressing any of those previous harms. And so, again, just want to point out how important the clarity and the approach becomes in thinking about using the reparations framework around some of this. And then,
can I say something real quick to that?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Just one thing that I meant to mention. One of the things in the legalization of recreational cannabis, there were three pillars. There was the criminal justice bucket, the business piece, and then the tax revenues. There are a lot of people that focused on the business part of it, right? And for me, that was one of the things that we were super clear about, that while there is important things to weigh in on the business front of it. In terms of the community benefit, we focused on the tax revenues. And the reason we focused on the tax revenues, because in thinking about the ability to ensure community impact, so to make sure the community benefited from it, as opposed to what ended up happening in the business part of it, is there were a handful of black people that were able to get access to resources to get licensed. And that was framed as if that would be empowering to black people, right? So we were really intentional around the tax revenues, because we didn't want it to be a situation where a handful of black folks got wealthy, the masses of our community didn't benefit, right? And then it becomes something that our community then says failed, right? And so for us, that's why we focus on that tax revenue part and the public good. So I just want to add that in, particularly in terms of the contrast to what happened in Illinois, Chicago.
Yep. No, I appreciate that. That's the perfect segue. As we think about, reparations and addressing specific harms that have been done to the black community, right? The harm takes place at the group level, right? And then the redress often is spoken about as like an individual being able to then benefit. And so if you all could speak to the way that collective stewardship or collective control are playing a role in how you're thinking about, restitution within these different campaigns.
I do want to tag team off of what Davon said in terms of the, paying attention and focusing on the tax revenue. Because, that's like the unsexy thing, right, to talk about. When, especially in government, every single government literally follows the money. And like how you follow what's going to happen in terms of policy, you need to follow the budget. If it's not in the budget, it's just going to be rhetoric, right? And that's one of the work I was focusing on, particularly in the wake of, the murder of George Floyd. There was a lot of campaigns, right? Businesses all across the globe had a marketing campaign that Black Lives Matter, that they cared about black people, that, we're going to be in solidarity on the front lines for reparations. But you didn't see it in their numbers. Right? You didn't see in their numbers. You saw very temporary positions that opened up in DEI, and even now, fast forward to today, there's a total attack on those DEI professions, and also attack on black venture capitalists and black venture investments. So to your point around, sometimes the conversation is very limited to just like human resources, or even like the conversation is limited around black people and wealth building and reparations to just criminal justice reform. I think about the interview on the Breakfast Club with Charlamagne tha God, and I believe it was, President Joe Biden was running at the time, and Charlamagne tha God had questioned him and said, how come when we ask what's your agenda for black people, politicians often go to criminal justice reform, as if black people only live within the scope of criminalization, or within the scope of prisons, or within the scope of policing, right? We need to think more broadly, particularly around black wealth building has to exist within economic justice. They have to exist in our budget across the board. And one of the things, particularly around what we're looking at, is building out departments and expanding departments within the city of St. Paul. We have currently the Financial Empowerment Department, which is focused on a series of initiatives. But one of those series of initiatives is expanding financial tools, not just financial counseling, because a community group who were, striving don't need financial coaching if they don't actually have the capital to actually build the wealth. So we need to have access to real wealth building tools. And one of those tools, like for example, just giving you an example from my life, we have credit unions. And how come within our credit unions we have what's called savings, but we have what's called money markets? Can we say money markets?
Money markets.
Money markets is a tool that literally your money makes money while it's in that account. But a lot of us don't really know about these type of tools that exist because they have not been, not only taught to us, education-wise, or we just haven't been born or brought up into those families that have those type of financial tools. So we want to ensure that when we are investing in our communities, that we're investing in tools in ways that's going to make money. And also, we want to talk about on the collective. I really appreciate your point around we can't just have just a few leaders capitalizing and benefiting off of, the backs of so many people who fought to decriminalize cannabis. Here in St. Paul, we're on the early cusp of creating policies, and that's definitely one of them. Making sure that we have a reparative justice fund that addresses the impacts of the war on drugs. Not only just the criminalization of Black people, but also addressing the mental health impacts it caused on us. Addressing, the impacts of crack cocaine in our neighborhoods, which hits very, very, very real. Also, utilizing funds, particularly we have a settlement here, tens and tens of millions of dollars settlements that the city is receiving, particularly from the opioid crisis. And really addressing how we're approaching opioid crisis very differently of how we did in the 80s and the 90s with crack and cocaine, where we didn't have the level of empathy. We didn't see it as a mental health or a drug recovery or a public health crisis. We saw it as just, a very enforcement, punitive problem. So we're trying to right those harms as well to ensure that we have treatment facilities that's ran by the people that they are serving. And also we're having culturally relevant not only treatment, but mental health, therapy, having healing centers, and how we're approaching it in a holistic wellness way. Another thing I'll mention, to your point too, around businesses, we don't have in the city of St. Paul, I think we just have in the entire state, only one Black-owned, Black-ran brick-and-mortar cannabis business here. So we want to expand that. And we also want to not only expand that here in St. Paul, but we want to ensure that it is something that is continuously getting funded, and that is something that we can do, particularly around how we use our funds. And lastly, I just want to put out there, I had a pleasure to meet Robin. Robin is the executive director of the First Repair organization. She was also city council of Evanston, Illinois. I was in Geneva a couple months ago for the Permanent Forum on People of African Descent. It's out of the Office of Human Rights for the United Nations. And reparations was one of the 3 pillars. And it was a very powerful experience to hear how Haiti approaches the conversation around reparations, from Canada, how they approach the conversations around reparations, and also the United States. And when we talk about reparations, it's on a global scale, because we now are living in a day where, capitalism is the ruling economy, right? And capitalism is very exploitive, very extractive. And as we were talking about building an economy that with shared power and shared wealth building, we're going to have to expand and have those networks and the connections on a global scale. But to wrap it up, in terms of when I had a chance to meet Robin, she's a very, very powerful leader. We were actually able to have her be a partner, particularly for St. Paul's Reparations Commission. And so this work doesn't happen in silos, right? So what was successful at Evanston, we can also have here in St. Paul. But I also want to share too, when we talk about, when we're supporting leaders who are successful with establishing reparations, we need our legal partners, our legal attorneys and stuff there for us to help us, because they're gonna still come after us. What we see in Evanston, they're now dealing with lawsuits, right? So we can, be bold and courageous and make this work happen, but we also have to ensure that we're not doing it alone. No, we have to be in a strong partnership to ensure that we're protecting reparations. Mm-hmm.
So the issue of collective stewardship, because I think when we talk about what reparations is, and again, I want to reiterate kind of what I said in the beginning and some of what Renee mentioned in the very beginning, which is that, reparations comes from a very particular worldview that recognizes that, people of African descent were brought to this country as an act of war, right? We're prisoners of war, right? And so we are looking to establish our sovereignty and the ability to practice freedom. Collective stewardship and thinking about community control, to me, is an essential element if we're seriously talking about reparations, right? So there are good social welfare programs, right? But it's important to distinguish that from reparations. And again, what is key to reparations is collective stewardship, which is something that requires development of a range of institutions that are going to be necessary to operationalize a true reparations policy, right? And I think, unfortunately, because of the ideology of this country that is very much a kind of liberal individualism, right? So we focus so much on how do we get individual people upwardly economically mobile, right? And again, while that's not in and of itself bad, that frame, right? What it does is that it robs us of the understanding that there's certain kinds of institutions that we need in order to truly put reparations into practice. So for instance, one of the things, we did a toolkit, my organization, for jurisdictions outside of Baltimore looking to frame the funds that will come to them from the Community Repair Reinvestment Fund that I mentioned. And so in addition to human services, one of the examples we give are being able to put public dollars into collective ownership of land, collective ownership of property, right? Or worker-owned cooperatives, right? Community-controlled cooperatives. These are examples, but a part of, in order to do those things, we have to organize the infrastructure in order to be able to make those things happen, right? We have to build the kind of institutional machinery to be able to make those things happen. So I'm reiterating that because in the conversation around collective stewardship, and it's not as simple as an attitude. Like we have to build the muscle of practicing collaboration and democratic institutional formation. Like that's something that has to be practiced, and it's much more complex than I think people would like it to be in terms of how do you make decisions, right? Who gets to determine what types of capital comes into the institution, right? How, when someone says they're a community-based organization, are they a community-based organization because I'm Davon and people in the community like me individually, right? Or do you have an organization that is structured in such a way that there are actual mechanisms of accountability to the community itself? And so I think those are essential questions if we're seriously talking about reparations. Otherwise, it gets sucked into what I've described as kind of the mainstream of reparations, where it becomes primarily just about how do individual people get a check, right? And again, I think we're all clear that reparations is much bigger than that. Not that a check is off the table as a part of it, but that's not the focus of what we're talking about when we say reparations.
Yeah, and just to drive that point home, Davon, right? I think that the collective stewardship and thinking about reparations and repairing Black folks, African people, to our inherent ways of being, into our indigenous ways of being, communal forms of organization, right? Part of reparations requires us to think about what does it mean to be repaired on our own terms, and not within the current framework or the current ideology that we exist in, right? And so I think that is also why the institution building around cooperatives and collective stewardship becomes so important. And maybe going back to something you said, Anika, if maybe we could talk a little bit about, Rondo being this historic Black community that, like many Black communities, was decimated to make way for highways, right? During the Highway Act and the federal government plowing over Black neighborhoods, often splitting them in two from the city center or whatever that looks like. But, part of what has been in play here in St. Paul to restore Rondo is also some work around a community land trust, right? And how important that as a mechanism becomes to reclaim some of the land. So I just wonder if you want to speak any more to that.
Yeah, absolutely. So here in St. Paul, we have, it was actually one of the first community-based land trusts that was established in, I believe, the Midwest, but I know for sure in Minnesota, called the Rondo Community Land Trust. They've been in existence for over 30 years. They just actually hired their first Rondo descendant. Her name is Makia Griffin, to be the executive director there. And Rondo Community Land Trust is just came out of the Black movement. I think about so many Black leaders from the South, from all over, even within the Black Panther movement, that had a call of action around what does collective ownership look like. And for the Rondo Community Land Trust, it was essentially to preserve land. Here in St. Paul, we also are experiencing gentrification on a very accelerated level. Right, where people who are large investors are coming in and buying up land. So it was actually established for families to be able to keep collective ownership of their land. There's actually a tour this Saturday if people are interested in joining that tour and getting a tour of the neighborhood that I grew up in. There's also, when we talk about institutions, I used to serve as the vice president for the Minneapolis NAACP. And they're about to have their, I believe, 106th year anniversary. And they are institutions. NAACP is an institution that has served the face of time really out of the abolitionist movement, right? Where folks was coming out of slavery and they needed advocacy, they needed support, they needed those, not only support, but like housing, right? In so many different ways. So here in St. Paul is the home of Roy Wilkins here at NAACP. And I think about a lot of the roles that the NAACP played, particularly around our public education system, where we had a lawsuit in the 60s, a racial discrimination lawsuit that allowed for St. Paul Public Schools to expand their schools to allow for more Black kids to actually get proper education, get up-to-date books, to have like quality buildings for their students. And when, as we're continue on in terms of like institutions that serve this Twin Cities, we have the Twin Cities Urban League as well too, and we have a lot of institutions that came about after the murder of George Floyd. But we need to have a deeper respect and investment in those leaderships, organizations that continue to advocate for us. So. For Rondo Community Land Trust, I think people should definitely look into it more. I don't serve on their board. I am familiar, particularly around how the city's investing in it. We have a $2.5 million fund that goes into organizations that are looking to have cooperative businesses, particularly here in St. Paul. And Rondo Community Land Trust also is a partner with our Inheritance Fund, which is our return to home policy. So for future homeowners who are looking to purchase a home back in the Rondo community, who were descendants of the families that were displaced from the deconstruction, of Rondo, we have down payment assistance programs available for them as well. But I think on the, in terms of what we need to do to strengthen our institutions is really important, because like to your point, I think sometimes when we look at reparations or anything around like Black Power movement, we think about it in a very individualistic way, right? Like that leader who is disrupting not only spaces or disrupting policies, actually positions our community to be burnt out. It puts our communities in a place of not only like not being able to persevere for the work it takes to actually push for these type of policies. So if we have like stronger organizations in Minnesota, I think that would support the work that we are seeking to do.
So we're coming up on time. I'm gonna ask Davon just to give his closing thoughts, and then we'll close out.
One thing I want to quickly address. And it's a small disagreement. When we talk about the mainstream civil rights organizations that have played a role, right, in Black freedom struggle. One of the challenges with many of our traditional civil rights organizations and many mainstream Black organizations is that many of them are reliant on philanthropy and their proximity to certain like white progressive networks or white liberal networks, or even corporate, right, proximity to corporate institutions that become the basis of their ability to do the work, right? And I think one of the challenges that we have is that many of the existing formations that we have are designed in a way that in some ways are at odds with the agenda around reparations, right? And to put it more bluntly, you know, there are many of us who don't recognize that the integrationist impulse that I think is the default in American culture, it is that integrationist impulse that produces the lack of power, right, that as a community we're able to exercise, right? And so I think we have to be really precise about, when we talk about the different role of different organizations and the importance of reparations in a form that is empowering to Black people, right? For me to contrast, for instance, like, you know, Garvey and the UNIA, Republic of New Africa, you know, Black Panther Party for Self-Defense, like these are the organizations of which the demand for reparations was the most salient and the most ardent theoreticians and practitioners of, you know, political activity around reparations. So for me, that's extremely important, because I think there are some attempts to again absorb reparations into good social welfare policy, right? And what that'll do is it feeds the dynamic where the institutions that represent Black people are having to capitulate to mainstream white institutions and navigate the society in a way where white people have veto power ultimately over what our institutions do. When we look at the boards of many of these institutions and where those resources come from, I just think we have to be very precise about the kinds of institutions, where their resources come from, and what are the mechanisms of accountability to their community. Many of these organizations, mainstream organizations, their boards are populated by folks that come from the corporate sector, right, or major players in the nonprofit and philanthropic sector. That's not accountability to the community. And so those organizations being in the position that they're in create the dynamic where there's this alienation between the masses of our community and being able to deliver on policy that actually benefits the masses. So for me, again, I just want to stress the importance that they're going to need to be new formations that emerge, that think about organizational structure in a way where folks are actually accountable to the community as a part of the structure of the organization itself. And again, that is a complicated task, but it's a task that I think is essential if we're going to be able to have any kind of reparations policy that is not the traditional integrationist, let's just get more Black people in the big houses, right? But something that truly gives Black people power so that we're not having to rely on the benevolence of people outside of our community for our quality of life.
I just want to, thank you. I definitely agree with you. You know, Ida B. Wells, who was my Shero, you know, she was one of the co-founders of the NAACP. She had a breakaway because of that very thing that you're talking about. But when I, you know, mentioned the NAACP, Urban League, and some of these institutions, they had the civil lawsuit tool. You know, a lot of the policies that we benefit today wouldn't have happened if it wasn't a legal action to be, you know, taken. And I think, you know, yes, those institutions, you know, are at risk of being compromised, and like you mentioned, you know, at the whim of white philanthropic dollars. But at the same time, those are the organizations are where our, you know, legal leaders, our attorneys, you know, our scientists are, you know, not to get to the 10 percenters, but in terms of we need all of them, right? So I do think, yes, there is opportunities for our organizations to be compromised, but we have to ensure that we are also supporting our leaders who are on the battlefields in spaces that like all Black people cannot be.
So to wrap us up and to close out, I think that I'm so grateful to have this conversation, right, in this space in particular, and to think about the new possibilities that we are creating by building the muscle around collective stewardship, around cooperation, right? And trying to think about how we use that in service to Black liberation, right? And reparations just being, one key part of that, but that really thinking about collective governance, participation, right? Collective ownership, getting to new ways of being, as they were also talking about on the panel in the plenary this morning. How the work that we're currently doing, right, I think also requires us to have a larger vision of what's possible and how Black people truly experience, right, freedom and liberation, like in the context of this country. So with that, I'm gonna thank the panelists and thank all of you.
So let's give our panel a round of applause again. And so we need to make sure that we go about our days ahead conversing and being energized about this topic so that we keep the conversation going and we move it forward in our communities. I just want to take a minute and thank our sponsors. We could not have put this conference on for you without our sponsors, Blue Cross and Blue Shield of Minnesota, the Cooperative Development Foundation, the ICA Group, the National Cooperative Bank, the National Grocers Cooperative, Shared Capital Cooperative, Cabot, Cooperative Fund of the Northeast, Mississippi Market Co-op, Northwest Area Foundation, Ralph K. Morris Foundation, and Youth Prize. Lastly, I want to thank you for joining us today, the first day of our third annual conference on the Black Cooperative Agenda. We would like to hear more from you, so please take a brief survey today. The surveys will be located in your sessions and at the registration desk. So make sure that you look for the QR codes, take the survey, and make sure that you give your feedback on everything that has transpired today. Lastly, we have, again, 4 sessions for you to partake in this afternoon. The first session will begin at 1:30, and that's Planning Cooperative Youth Projects. That's in the recap room, the red cap room, I'm sorry. The next session, Legal Framework, Veterans Gallery. The third session, Navigating Best Practices and Challenges, the Gateway Conference Room. And lastly, the fourth session, Fostering Creativity, Riverview Conference Room. So those sessions will begin at 1:30, and immediately following your session, we will convene back here in this room for our networking reception at 3:30 today. So we look forward to you being engaged in the next 4 sessions and returning here at 3:30 for our networking session. So enjoy the rest of your afternoon.